CKGSB, China's only not-for-profit independent business school.
Yeah, I think if you look at Chinese companies and the progression they've taken, I think previously, I think it was much more around looking at distressed assets. So going into, for example, TCL buying something like Thomson. What we see now, I think, is actually a lot different. I think that's really Chinese companies looking to go overseas, for a variety of business reasons. Those are stemmed from, I think, the market getting very competitive here. So companies are looking to go overseas for new technology, especially advanced technology. They're looking to get global management talent so they can start kind of instilling some of those best practices into their organization. Additionally, they're looking to get global brands to help them appeal to an overseas audience. And I think the other very real motivation is to diversify away from the Chinese market. And I think these four factors combined are a lot different from what we saw previously. I think as you look at kind of the distinction between emerging markets and developed markets and the approach that Chinese companies take, I really think it comes down to their business model. So for example, if you look at companies in the business to consumer space, I think those are the ones that are starting to do fairly well in some of the emerging markets because they're more easily able to adapt many of their product offering and also business practices for markets in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and it makes them that much better off. Looking at the business-to-business space, though, I think you see more and more of these companies going into developed markets because that's where they're getting advanced technology. That's where they're able to essentially get some of these global managers that will strengthen their business. So for example, you look at the company Goldwind. It's one of China's largest wind energy firms. They've done extremely well over the years. And what they did was they purchased a company in Europe called Vensis, got their technology, not only expanded their presence in Europe, but then also developed a unique Americas business that focuses on both North America and Central and South America. I do think companies like Lenovo are kind of the exception at this stage. I think it's going to be quite some time until you see companies, especially in the B2C space, that are able to compete effectively in developed markets. And I think the reason behind this is, it's a very different business environment, especially for companies that don't have that experience operating within, a much stricter regulatory environment. And just the fact that, they don't necessarily know who to go to for that kind of advice. And, I think Lenovo's done an exceptionally good job at this, but right now I think they're exception. I think the vast majority of Chinese companies have quite a bit to learn in developed markets. When you're looking at developed markets, I think the vast majority of Chinese companies aren't ready. In my book, I argue that there's really 5 relationships that Chinese companies need to master in order to do it effectively. I think first, they need to understand how to interact with the government. And I think that's not just within the overseas market, but also here in China. I mean, for a Chinese company to go overseas for the first time, they may need to interact with the NDRC, MOFCOM, SASIC, SAFE if they want to get their money outside of China. It's a very complex process. And for a company that, isn't fairly large in size, it can be very difficult to understand really how to navigate that system and what the right path is. Additionally, when Chinese companies go to, the US or Europe, they have a tendency to want to rely on the government to give them, more direction as to where to invest. And they're finding that, the only way to get that insight is really through relying on professional services firms, whether that be tax advisors, management consultants, accountants. These are the people that know how to, play by the regulations in these different markets. And, oftentimes Chinese companies want to just continue that government relationship kind of model that they do here in China. The next thing that I point to is their relationship with employees. As you look at any company when they go overseas, I think there tends to be a need to balance between a centralized organization and a decentralized organization. So how do you maximize the fact that you have a global company, but also the fact that you have people on the ground that can respond more quickly to change? And what I've seen just through my research was, I interviewed, dozens of executives who were running Americas and running Europe for large Chinese companies. And, they told me at the beginning of their time that, they were very optimistic about the opportunity that they had. And then just not a few years later, but a couple years later, I guess, after I had finished my research, I went back out to them and many of them they were no longer working there. And that was either because they were fired or they proactively left. And when I reached out to them, I asked, what happened? They told me, they said, Joel, I wasn't able to make the decisions that I wanted to, that I knew were the right decisions to make, and that, corporate headquarters back in China, they had unrealistic expectations for the market and really how fast it was going to take for them to be successful. I think there are some very valid concerns, and I think those are, they're going to vary depending on whether it's the government level, the business level, or the consumer level. I mean, I think if you're looking at a host country like the United States and what's the government worried about, national security is number one, cybersecurity, the supply of natural resources and China's ability to manipulate global resources. Looking at the companies, it's anti-competitiveness, it's IP theft, it's what happens after that acquisition. Will a company be purchased, and then will all of the employees then be fired and the factory and the technology go back to China? And then at the consumer level, consumers are worried about food quality, environment, labor standards when their husbands and wives are actually working in these companies. And I think Chinese companies have quite a bit to overcome. You look at Smithfield Foods and Shuanghui International last year in the United States. At the time when Shuanghui announced that they wanted to purchase Smithfield, which is a pork producing company, just a few months earlier there were massive headlines globally in Shanghai about there were thousands of dead pigs that floated mysteriously along the Huangpu River. So when you're reading headlines about floating dead pigs, tainted milk, food security, these are all things that perpetuate this whole idea that is it going to be safe for Chinese firms to be operating in my own backyard? And so consumers worry, the media plays it up, and politicians really take it to work to their favor. Ultimately, though, based on my research, I found that the number of deals that are politicized are actually quite small, but they're the ones that are talked about all the time. Meanwhile, I think the U.S. is very open to investment, and you'll see that when you actually dig into the data, and you'll see that when you actually look at the other side, which is what are the positives of Chinese investment. And I think as long as you have the right security review and anti-competitive mechanisms within the government, you can strike that right balance between essentially mitigating the negative consequences while really maximizing that positive benefit.